What if I told you that one of the strongest armies in the world went to war not against tanks, not against another country, but against birds? And not just any birds, giant, fast, and stubborn creatures that refused to back down. Sounds crazy, right? Haha, well, it actually happened. Meet the emu, a bird that can grow taller than a man, run faster than a horse, and take bullets like a tank. And on the other side, the Australian military, armed with machine guns and full battle tactics. These two very different forces clashed in one of the strangest, funniest, and most embarrassing wars in history. This was the Great Emu War.
Imagine this. It's 1932 in Western Australia. The sun beats down on dry farmland, wheat fields stretch across the horizon, and desperate farmers pray that this year's harvest will feed their families and keep them alive. But instead of drought or locusts, the threat they face comes from something far stranger. Tall, feathery, and running on two powerful legs. The enemy? Emus. Yes, the giant flightless birds of Australia. And soon they would cause chaos unlike anything the world had ever seen. To understand how a war against birds even began, we need to look at the situation Australia was in during the early 1930s. The Great Depression was in full swing. Prices for wheat had crashed, and farmers in Western Australia were struggling to survive. Many of them were war veterans, men who'd fought in World War I and had been promised farmland as a reward for their service. But instead of living in peace, they found themselves locked in a new kind of battle, one for their livelihood. And that's when the emus arrived. Every year after the breeding season, emus migrated across the country. They were looking for food and water, and they found both in the farmers' wheat fields. In 1932, there were around 20,000 emus roaming Western Australia. Imagine being a farmer watching helplessly as flocks of these giant birds, standing 6 feet tall, weighing more than 30 kilograms and running faster than a horse, stormed your land, trampling crops and devouring wheat. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a disaster. The farmers were furious. They worked through sweat and struggle to plant their crops, only to see them destroyed by what looked like an invading army of birds. And in a way, it was an invasion. The emus moved in groups, tearing through fields like soldiers on the march. To the farmers, it felt like a war, and they wanted the government to do something about it. They wrote letters, sent complaints, and begged for help. But here's where the story takes its bizarre twist. Instead of simply building better fences or offering rewards for hunters, the Australian government made a decision that sounds like a joke but was all too real. They decided to send in the army. Yes, you read that right. In response to birds eating wheat, Australia rolled out soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns, the same kind of weapons used in World War I. It was as if the government thought they were fighting a human enemy, not flightless birds. Farmers were relieved at first, thinking this military action would solve their problem once and for all. After all, how could birds possibly stand up to machine guns? But what no one realised yet was that these birds were tougher, faster, and smarter than anyone gave them credit for. What was meant to be a quick, clean operation would soon turn into one of the strangest and most embarrassing chapters in military history. The stage was set, the soldiers were ready, the emus were waiting, and the war, if you can call it that, was about to begin. When the Australian government finally agreed to help the farmers, their solution was straight out of a war movie. In November 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was sent to Western Australia with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and around 10,000 rounds of ammunition. To many, it seemed like overkill. After all, they were only fighting birds. But to the desperate farmers, this looked like salvation. Surely the mighty Australian army would wipe out the problem in days. The plan was simple: use the machine guns to mow down the birds as they invaded the wheat fields. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. The emus didn't behave like easy targets. These weren't chickens in a pen. They were wild, fast, and surprisingly tactical. The first encounter happened near Campion, a small farming town. About 50 emus were spotted. The soldiers got into position, aimed their machine guns, and prepared to open fire. But before they could get many shots off, the birds scattered into smaller groups, sprinting in different directions. Their speed, up to 30 miles per hour, made them almost impossible to hit. Instead of falling in neat rows, the emus dodged and darted across the fields, leaving behind only dust and frustration. Major Meredith cried again a few days later. This time, nearly 1,000 emus were spotted moving together. It seemed like the perfect chance for a massacre. The soldiers set up their guns and opened fire. Bullets flew into the flock and feathers scattered in the air. But once again, the emus broke formation, zigzagging in every direction. To make matters worse, one of the machine guns jammed and the rest of the flock escaped into the scrub. The soldiers quickly realized something shocking. Fighting emus was harder than fighting human soldiers. Meredith even joked later, saying, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." Over the following weeks, the campaign dragged on. Soldiers chased the birds with trucks mounted with guns, but the terrain was rough and the emus outran the vehicles. Farmers tried to herd the birds into kill zones, but the flocks always seemed to slip through. Reports claim that for every 10 bullets fired, maybe one bird was killed. The rest kept running. The press caught wind of the fiasco and had a field day. Headlines mocked the military's failure, painting a picture of brave soldiers defeated by birds. Politicians were embarrassed. What was meant to be a quick solution now looked like a national joke. By December 1932, after weeks of failed attempts, the government quietly called off the operation. The soldiers returned home, their mission incomplete. In total, only about 1,000 emus were killed out of the 20,000 wreaking havoc. The birds had won. It wasn't just a loss, it was a humiliation. The world had seen emus outsmart the Australian army, and the so-called Great Emu War entered history as one of the strangest military defeats ever recorded.
When the guns went silent and the soldiers packed up, Western Australia was left with a strange truth. The emus had survived and the farmers were still in trouble. The government had promised protection, but all they got was a short, clumsy campaign that made the army look foolish. For the farmers, the Emu War felt like a joke at their expense. Their crops were still being eaten, and the birds still roamed the land in massive flocks. The newspapers had a blast with the story. Articles described the emus as if they were military geniuses. Some papers wrote about emu commanders giving orders, while others joked that the birds deserved medals for bravery. Cartoons mocked the army, showing soldiers running from giant birds. The story spread beyond Australia, and soon people around the world were laughing at the idea of soldiers losing to animals. But for the farmers, it wasn't funny. They still faced ruined fields and hungry families. Wheat was scarce, and the global economy was already in the Great Depression. Every grain mattered. Many felt betrayed by their leaders. They asked, if the army can't even handle birds, how can we trust them with real threats? The government, embarrassed by the backlash, tried other solutions. They offered rewards for killing emus, encouraging hunters to shoot them. Bounties were paid for emu beaks, and some farmers organised local hunts. This worked a little better, but the emu population was huge, and the birds kept coming back year after year. Interestingly, scientists later pointed out that the emus weren't invading out of malice. They were simply following their natural instincts. The vast wheat fields looked like paradise to them, an endless supply of food and water during dry seasons. From the emu's perspective, it wasn't war, it was survival. Meanwhile, Major Meredith, the man who led the soldiers, gave some of the most famous quotes about the fiasco. He described the emus as incredibly tough, saying it took multiple bullets to bring one down. He even admitted that the birds used smart tactics, splitting into small groups so they were harder to catch. His words, meant half as a joke, ended up making the emus sound like elite soldiers in their own right. So who really won the Emu War? On paper, the answer is obvious: the emus. They kept their territory, they kept their numbers, and they exposed the weakness of human arrogance. The army walked away in defeat, but in another sense, nobody truly won. The farmers lost their harvests, the government lost respect, and the soldiers lost pride. The only ones who seemed to benefit were the emus, who gained a kind of legendary status. Over time, the story of the Emu War became less about farming and more about identity. Australians began retelling it not as a tragedy, but as a kind of dark comedy. It showed the absurdity of history, the idea that sometimes nature can't be controlled no matter how many guns you bring. And that's why, even today, the Emu War is remembered, not as a real war, but as a reminder of human limits and the surprising power of birds. Nearly a century later, the Emu War still refuses to be forgotten. It lives on in memes, jokes, school lessons and pub stories across Australia. But beyond the humour, it carries important lessons about people, nature and pride. First, it showed that humans don't always have control, no matter how powerful their weapons seem. The Australian Army had machine guns, soldiers and strategy, but they underestimated their opponent. The emus weren't weak, they were fast, resilient and perfectly adapted to the land. The war proved that technology doesn't always guarantee victory, especially when the enemy is nature itself. Second, it revealed a deeper truth about farming in Australia. The Emu War wasn't just about birds eating wheat, it was about people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. The farmers were war veterans promised support after fighting in World War I. Instead, they came home to barren soil, low wheat prices, and now an invasion of emus. The government's decision to send in the army looked ridiculous, but it also exposed how desperate and abandoned those farmers felt. Third, the Emu War became a story about identity. Australians often use humour to deal with failure, and the Emu War turned into a national joke that people laugh at instead of cry about. It's not remembered with shame, but with irony. An example of how Australia can turn even disaster into a legend. In a strange way, the defeat gave the nation one of its most unique historical stories. But the most fascinating part is the way the emus came out of it. They became more than just birds. They became symbols of resilience. They didn't ask for war, but they endured it and thrived. Today, the emu is one of Australia's national animals, standing proudly on the country's coat of arms. Think about that for a moment. The same bird that defeated the army is now a symbol of Australia itself. That's the kind of poetic twist history loves to deliver. Modern historians and wildlife experts now see the Emu War as a cautionary tale. It warns us about trying to control nature with brute force instead of understanding it. The farmers wanted to wipe the birds out, but the solution turned out to be long-term management, using fencing, better farming methods, and coexisting with wildlife. The lesson? Sometimes the answer isn't to fight nature, but to adapt to it. And that's why the Emu War still matters. It wasn't just a funny failure, it was a reminder of humility, that even with guns, governments and armies, people can still be outsmarted by something as simple as a bird. And maybe, just maybe, it leaves us with a question. If a flock of birds could humble an army, what else in nature is strong enough to humble us today?